Steph in Texas. What's going on, Steph?
Hi, Steph.
Hey, I'm fine. How are you both?
I'm doing just great.
I'm just starting my first beer, so the night is young.
Yeah, there you go. How can we help you today,
All right.
Steph?
Well, I was wondering if either of you had formulated an opinion on gender abolitionism, or if you even knew what that was.
Yeah, so Neil and I were talking because we saw you come up right before the show, and I think I had an opinion, and then Neil hadn't heard of it before, right?
No, I hadn't.
Yeah, so Steph, if you could explain to Neil what gender abolitionism is and to our audience, I think that'd be great.
Mm-hmm.
Sure. You'll probably get different answers depending on who you talk to, but I think generally it's regarded at the belief that gender roles in society aren't necessarily based on science or fact, and their very presence and their continued propagation is harmful, not just to individuals, but to society as a whole.
Yeah, so kind of the idea is, and from my understanding, is to kind of get rid of the idea of gender in general. You see this with other kinds of things too. I think another common one is people who want to kind of get rid of the idea of race,
color blindness.
Yeah, but in more of the sense of like they don't even want it to be a thing that ever comes up. Like they don't want any forms that have race on it. They don't want it to be a thing in general. And there's different arguments for both sides. I have to say that I think there are some really good arguments for gender abolitionism, Steph. The one thing that holds me back is just the idea that, and I'll give some of the good arguments, right? I think what's good about it is this idea that we're all kind of on equal footing, right? And that, and that gender isn't going to determine your place in life or your path in life, and that you can just do what you want to do without that construct kind of holding you back. But the one thing that holds me back is I also want to respect people's identities when they present them. So I wouldn't want to tell a trans person that their identity isn't valid or that we shouldn't even refer to it, because that's an identity that they've wanted to express for themselves. And I like being a guy. I like expressing myself as a guy. And so, that's something that I think a lot of people have personal attachment to. So I see arguments for both sides, but what do you think about it, Steph?
Well, just to address your point, so with self-identification or gender identification, it's just something that we do as a social contract or as a way to show that we acknowledge people and their agency. It'd be very similar to, is your full name, your legal name Dan, or is that just something you go by?
My legal name is Objectively, last name Dan. Just kidding. That's not actually true. But yeah, no, part of the joke of the name Objectively Dan is that it's only like names themselves are only objective in the sense that we have like legal documents for them, but like it doesn't, beyond that, it's kind of also just kind of a construct. So yeah.
Yeah. So if someone's name was they told you Ben, you wouldn't hound them and be like, no, your name is Benjamin. I've seen your birth certificate. Right. Don't lie to me.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, exactly.
Right? So gender abolitionism doesn't necessarily involve looking at trans men and women and invalidating them. I think that's a pretty radical approach. Well, even considering that gender abolitionism generally is pretty radical. You definitely want to respect people's identity and their agency and give them the freedom to do the things that they want. It's not so much on an individual level, it's more on a societal level.
Yeah, and Steph, the only reason I brought up the trans example is because I think that's an example of, I think, someone in society who has fought really hard to present themselves with a certain gender identity. And so I use that as kind of an extreme to be like, I don't want to take that away from somebody. I don't want to take away someone who has fought really hard to present themselves in a certain way. Just do that. And with straight people, whatever, but like, I didn't earn this right. I didn't have to fight for a right to exist the way that I have.
That's right.
Yeah. And so like the idea, I guess, behind that, I think, is I want to respect people's gender however they want to present themselves. And I don't know, it seems to me, and maybe you'd have to convince me, Steph, that gender abolitionism does kind of invalidate that.
Yeah, well, it comes down to, you have those feelings and those opinions, but necessarily where did they come from? How did you develop them? It's generally from a form of empathy. You want to understand people, you want to respect them. But if you look at through the lens of skepticism or some other moral lenses, it makes it kind of a lot more murky, your basis for saying that, if that makes sense. So,
yeah, what kind of moral...
Just so we're on the same page.
Yeah, I'm curious what you mean by moral lenses.
Well, let's just generally look at how you approach the world. So do you use skepticism or believe that skepticism is the best way to come to truth, or at least believing as many true things and believing as few false things as possible?
I think I would agree with that. Yeah.
Pragmatic skepticism.
Sure.
Yeah. So when you approach things from that perspective, the argument that we should respect people and we should look at how they identify and choose to present themselves, and we should keep prolonging that necessarily is more based on utility as opposed to pure skepticism. So, for instance, would you want to believe a false belief if it had a great amount of benefit, or necessarily disbelieve something that was true if it had a lot of harm?
Yeah, so I definitely, I wouldn't want to believe in something false, right? But I'm not sure, and maybe I'm jumping the gun a little bit, I'm not sure how a gender belief could be considered false or true necessarily. Like it just kind of is, right?
Yeah, so if you tell me your name's Dan or Objectively Dan, I can't say that that's not true, but if we wanted to look at, should we form some type of legal system? How should we build our public libraries when we decide and we vote on where do we want to have restrooms and stuff? Kind of looking at it from that lens isn't necessarily the best way, considering that even biological sex is more or less a social construct.
So let me try to rephrase so I understand. Are you saying that you're skeptical of the idea that is it the best way to continue identifying as, I think you used the example of Dan, but you're trying to maybe bridge it to just male or female, right? Is that the best way to work as a society? Yeah,
that's a good way to look at it. And it's because there isn't really actually anything that is a male, female, man, woman. These are completely arbitrary. You could come up with some form of system to try to separate people into these groups or categorize them. But if you use skepticism to look at all those categories, you're always just going to keep knocking them down and breaking them apart.
Yeah, well, but I almost think that when it comes to gender identities, it's not really about breaking them apart and breaking them down. It's just more of an idea of how someone can navigate the world most comfortably. And express themselves in the best way. Maybe me presenting as a man isn't the most rational thing in the world, but it's what makes me feel the best about myself and how I interact in society. And if that's true, then I would think that I would be okay with that. And we could talk about how that could be a false belief, but again, I'm not sure how we could even, if we are saying that men and women are these social constructs, then again, it's hard for me to say whether that, like, the true false kind of binary doesn't even apply. It's just a label that we use, right? Like, to navigate.
Yeah, well, you can identify yourself, but as soon as you start labeling it or deciding that, it would be better for me, therefore I should use it, as opposed to, well, it's actually creating a lot of harm on a societal level. Does that make sense? So even though you may be more comfortable identifying as a man, enjoying identifying and having activities that are typically masculine, you might actually be doing more harm by propagating these ideas and letting them keep going forward. That way, when there's a trans man, they have some preconception of what they should be like, and they may endure lots of emotional duress. They might experience physical harm from people who do not understand or necessarily respect them, because their idea of what a man is and how someone presents might not always line up.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, what's an example of a harm? And I think that's an interesting example. Another possible thing, and we were talking about, Neil and I were talking about this before the show too, is by creating kind of a monopoly on two genders as a binary system. We don't give credence to a lot of other gender identities, and that kind of also can be harmful to someone who doesn't know how to navigate their experiences, who don't have that template. And you're right, the templates that we do use for a majority of people does come with these kinds of implications. Like, there's a lot of other dudes that do a lot of shady stuff when it comes to straight white dudes, and that I don't particularly relate with, but it harms me. I hear people talk about how much they don't like men and stuff like that. It's like, yeah, I technically fall into that category, even though I may not have done the same actions as somebody else. But there's an argument for that, I think. But Neil, what do you think? Because I want to give you a chance to give your piece.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Well, like I was saying earlier, I just think that this needs to be normalized so that it's not causing harm anymore. Like, it should just be like everyone, you are who you are, and it should just be, well, I'm this, and then that's it. That's the end of the discussion. And it should be normal. Oh, okay, well, that's fine. Hey, let's go play baseball, or let's go have a coffee, or let's go do whatever, right? It should just be normalized, where it's not like somebody's trying to think about it or trying to make it an issue, I guess. But
to Steph's point, Neil, do you think that continuing to identify with the gender ideas that we currently use, could that possibly lead to harm at the end of the day?
Of course, sometimes it could, absolutely.
But you still think it's
to end?
Yeah,
but I think we work to normalization, then that will end eventually.
Okay. Yeah, Steph, I think you're presenting some argument, and that specific argument I hadn't thought of, as far as like, a trans person trying to identify as somebody else or identify as this boilerplate, trans man status, and then figuring out, there's men that do these awful things, and then that kind of affects them psychologically. Yeah, that's an angle I hadn't thought of before. But I'm assuming, I'm assuming, Steph, of course, your conclusion probably is that gender abolitionism is the way to go.
Yeah, I think there's no real factual basis for gender, or even, like I said earlier in passing, a biological sex. It's just it's a completely arbitrary thing. And as it currently exists, there is a significant population of trans men and women who are not just, like you alluded to, being emotionally harmed, but also being the victims of physical harm.
Oh, yeah.
Trans women are disproportionately the victims of sexual assault. They typically just basic things that you may take for granted, such as going to vote and having to show your ID, or applying for a job or social services where you need to fill out paperwork, that can cause emotional harm and duress. So generally working or advocating as a society that these things should be piecemeal dismantled until we can reach a point where we don't rely on them anymore, I think would be the most moral thing to do. And would probably be the thing that's best rooted in reality.
So, Steph, what do you think the first steps of implementing that would be on a societal level?
The first step for if anyone hears this and they decide, yeah, that sounds like a good idea, you definitely should vote. You should go out and you should vote for whichever candidate, whichever ideas you think best represent you. And that doesn't just mean, every 4 years in the United States. It means go to your local elections and be involved in the processes. Like, there are town halls, and you can go to that meeting, and the town hall will give you time, and you can sit there and you can say, hey, when we make this new library, I think that we should have not gendered bathrooms. I think that they're inherently harmful and that we should work to eliminate them. And you can do little things like this without necessarily creating harm, because this action itself doesn't invalidate people's trans identity. It just makes it so it's more inclusive and more accepting for people who don't, even trans women. There are some trans women who, there's this very bad idea in the culture of this idea called passing, that I want to look like a real woman. And that is just so toxic, and it's something that is only rooted by this idea that there is a ideal or almost kind of platonic woman form that exists somewhere out there.
Yeah, and that's a great point, Steph, because there is this idea that if you're not passing, you're not a real woman or you're not a real man, whatever real means, you know. And I agree with you. That's a really harmful idea. You should be able to
real doesn't mean anything because we all have our own idea of what real is, right?
Yeah, you should take that idea of man or take that idea of woman and do what you want with it, you know. And if that means having a traditional, I say traditional, in a traditional Americanized female aesthetic or male aesthetic, then that's fine. Like I'm for you there, and I'm also in agreement with you as far as gender neutral bathrooms. I think that's just a good idea. But you know what I want to take away from this, Steph, and I'll get to some other calls here in just a sec, is that I want to be someone who is doing what's morally right, or what I consider to be morally right. And this is a question of ethics, definitely. So do you think that, like, after this conversation, I should stop identifying as a man or identifying as male? Do you think that's the next ethical action I can take for myself?
It just depends on how you want to utilize the platform. If you think and you believe that this is the best thing for me and this is the best thing for society, then you should keep doing that. But other people might disagree and will honestly have no real way of knowing if you're doing harm or good, depending on how you identify yourself. It's more of a thing that it's kind of like the bystander problem. If we all just hold on to what we enjoy or what we feel comfortable with, it may end up making it so that as a society as a whole, we all do the same thing. And people who are more on the fringes, they're the ones who suffer from it.
Yeah, I agree with you there. Yeah. Like, one of the reasons why I started Truth Wanted was I wanted to change the way people were having discourses with people. And it was like, well, I'm just going to have to do it. I'm just going to have to be the example that I want to be, the change I want to see in the world, right? By like getting this thing started. Because that's just how you have to do it. All right, Steph. Well, I'll think about it. You've given me some pause tonight. I've played with the idea of gender abolitionism before. And I've always thought pretty positively about it, but you've also given me some new perspective. So thank you for that.
We can all identify.
No problem.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I look forward to hearing from you again. Until next time, have a great rest of your night.
Thanks, Steph.